Okay, hello and welcome to the first lesson on the unification of Germany. This lesson is part of Unit 1 and it looks at what was Germany like in the 1840s. So what are the outcomes of today's lessons? Today's outcomes are to understand how Germany did not exist and how it was rather a collection of states. We're going to explain what is meant by the German Confederation. We're also going to have a look at the roles of both Austria and Prussia. Key words I want you to take from today's lesson are state, confederation and decree. So let's start off by having a look at the geography of Germany in 1840. In 1840, Germany did not exist, but rather it was a collection of 39 independent states. Each of these states were their own country. So each would have its own ruler, its own governments, and it was not a collective union. The states had been this way since the Congress of Vienna in 1815. The Congress of Vienna was held after Napoleon of France had been defeated, and under Napoleon, France had invaded much of the land of Germany. They'd gone all the way across to Berlin, which you can see in the east of Germany here, and they'd controlled that land for a number of years. The Congress of Vienna was held to decide how that land should be split up, and to draw the new boundaries of each of the states. These states had existed beforehand, but some barriers moved, and some land changed hands. So when we're talking about 1840 as Germany, what we need to consider is that it was not one country. It is made up of 39 independent states. So now let's have a look at some of the important states that made up Germany. First of all, we have Prussia. And what's a bit weird about Prussia is it's actually split into two parts. One part is there on the east side of Germany, and the other part on the west. Now, the eastern part was the oldest part of Prussia. This is where Prussia originally was. But due to marriages between families, the King of Prussia had inherited this land on the west side of Germany. What we can see that's quite interesting, however, is that this land is split. So there are the states of Hanover and Hessen-Kassel that actually break up the two sections of Prussia. This meant it was actually quite a challenge to govern because it was hard to move both goods and armies between the two sections. Prussia at this time was quite a wealthy country. It made most of its money in the east of Germany, and that mainly came from wheat production. We're going to have a look at this again later. But what I want you to imagine for Prussia is big rolling fields. Okay, so it's a very fertile land, good for growing crops. The other important thing about Prussia was that it had a very strong army. Prussia was very militarily based, and this is a key asset that it brings while we look at unification of Germany. The next major state I want to talk about is Austria. Now, Austria was the most powerful state in the German area. Though today we look at Austria as being a separate country, at this time Austria was very close to these German states. So Austria was just as German at this point as Bavaria and Württemberg. What made Austria powerful, however, was it had its own empire. Its empire included countries like Hungary and Czechoslovakia. This meant that Austria had a lot more land to grow crops, so it had grown very rich, and it also had more soldiers to fight in its army. This meant that no real state other than Prussia could really stand up to Austria. Even Prussia would struggle due to the numbers Austria had. Now let's have a look at some of the countries that surround this area. On the left side of these German states we see France. France was one of the key major powers at this time, and it wanted to keep Germany split up. The reason it wanted Germany split into these 39 states is it made Germany weaker. Each state had its own king, its own government, and more importantly, its own army. And this meant getting all the states to fight together would take a lot of effort. It also would mean that control over the army would not be down to one leadership, and therefore it would be hard to control. So it was in France's interest to keep Germany in this state, so that it was weak. The same goes for Russia on the eastern side. Russia also wanted to keep Germany split up because not only did it make the German states weaker, but it also gave Russia a barrier between itself and France. This was a key important decision from Russia, as it meant that they weren't under the immediate threat of invasion. France would have to invade many small states before it got to Russia. So both France and Russia were really keen to see this 39 separate states continue. I'm going to have a little chat about some of the other states on here. Down the bottom you can see we've got Bavaria, Württemberg and Baden. These states were very close to Austria. They were heavily influenced by Austrian politics and power. The north of Germany was different, with states like Hanover, Saxony and Hessen-Kassel being very dominated by Prussian politics. So though all these states see themselves as German states, their loyalties lie in different places. So what was the German Confederation? We've already discussed that Germany was split into 39 completely independent states. So what does it mean when we talk about the German Confederation? I want to start off by saying that the German Confederation was not a new idea, but rather it was more of a return to an old area known as the Holy Roman Empire. This section of Europe had for many years been known as the Holy Roman Empire before Napoleon. And the Holy Roman Empire was a collection of states that was ruled over by an emperor. Now that emperor mainly came from Austria, but we're going to have a talk about that further later. So what do we mean by the word confederation? Well, a confederation is a loose political organisation formed by independent states. So this is where states come together to serve some of their purpose in a larger group. The confederation had its own constitution, so set of rules it had to follow, and its own parliament that was known as the Federal Diet. Each state would send its own representatives to this parliament, and they would speak on that state's behalf. The Confederation had little power over independent states, but it did have its own ambassadors and dealt with foreign powers and policy. So what does this mean? Well, when we talk about it having limited power over independent states, this means it had little control over the laws of that state. They could not disagree with a law introduced in one state or another, so they had no power to overturn any laws Prussia made, for example. If Prussia wanted to get rid of freedom of press, they were entitled to do so, and the German Confederation could not change that. Where the German Confederation came useful was on an international scale. With large foreign powers like France and Russia on either side, most German states were quite weak internationally, as they did not have the size, the money, or the army to have a large voice. However, by forming the German Confederation, they were able to come together and have a larger voice. Due to the combined wealth and army size, it made them more powerful on an international stage. So the Confederation would really make decisions to do with foreign policy. For example, they might decide that they need to go to war with Denmark over some of the land that was fought over in the north of Germany. They may also come together if it looks like France is willing to invade one of the states. They might also use this for trade deals, however this was rare at this time. Overall, the reason for the German Confederation is that it gave states a larger voice amongst the European powers of Russia, France and Britain. Now let's have a closer look at Austria. So what was the role of Austria? Austria had long been the largest power in the German Confederation. During the years of the Holy Roman Empire, the leader, known as the Archduke of Austria, was always the emperor. So Austria had a long history of controlling this area, of being the main power in this area. And this is something they wanted to keep hold of. After the defeat of Napoleon, Austria wanted to take back its control, and it wanted to do this by becoming the leading state in the German Confederation. It wanted to have the most representatives so it could win votes. It also wanted to control the high-powered positions within this confederation. Now this led to a lot of tension with Prussia, as Austria knew that they also wanted to control the confederation. This is important because we're going to see this a lot throughout this course. This battle between Prussia and Austria for control and dominance over this area is what's really going to be the driving force behind unification. So it's important now to know that from the outset of our course in 1840, Prussia and Austria were already rivals, and there was already tension building between them. Now we're going to have a look at Prussia. So what was the role of Prussia in 1840? Prussia at the time was led by a man called King Frederick William III, and it was the largest state in the north of the German Confederation. Its economy, as we discussed earlier, was mainly based on agriculture, and it was one of the largest wheat-producing areas in Europe. Now this is important because at this time bread still made up a major part of the diet people in Europe ate, so being able to produce large quantities of wheat meant that you could sell it to other countries and make large profits. It was this profit that helped fund Prussia and its army. There was, however, a small amount of industry that had started up in Prussia by 1840. There was industry in the area called Silesia and around Berlin. Now this is important because Britain had long before this gone through its own industrial revolution, and we are starting to see that impact move over to Germany, with Prussia itself starting to industrialise. Now the reason I bring this up now is that Prussia here are already a step ahead of Austria when we're talking about economy. Austria stuck with its agricultural economy for a long time, but even as early as 1840 we see Prussia starting to move into this new industrial economy. The major part of Prussia was the east of Prussia. This is where most of the power lied. There were large estates that were controlled by powerful aristocrats known as the Junkers. Now these estates would contain large areas of land where crops could be grown. It would also control all the villages and people that lived in those areas. This meant they were able to profit and become very rich off selling extra wheat and also collecting taxes from the people that lived on their estate. The Junkers were the most powerful group in the country, and it was from these families that most of the positions of government and the army were held. Now when we talk about positions within the army, we're not talking about regular soldiers. We're talking about officers. So what does that mean? Well, that means people like generals, majors and captains that controlled the troops, that gave them their instructions. This was seen as a very high job in Prussian society. The army was one of the most important parts of the Prussian government. In fact, Prussia was known for having its powerful army, and it was actually the main focus of both the king and the government. There is a saying about Prussia that you'll probably come across during this course, and that is, most states have an army, whereas the Prussian army has a state. Now what that means is, in most countries, the army's job is to stay there, protect the country, and to help it in times of need. Whereas the Prussian army was the biggest force within Prussia, and the state was merely there to fund it. So Prussia is a very military-based society. And this is going to be important as we move through the course, as while other countries and states try to use diplomacy, Prussia will use its army to try and get its way. So, what are the key points I want you to take away from this lesson? Number 1. Germany was made up of 39 independent states. Number 2. The two most powerful states were Austria and Prussia. Number 3. The German Confederation brought these states together to give them a more powerful voice internationally. Number 4. Austria's history led them to believe that they should control the Confederation. Number 5. This want for control led to tension with Prussia, who also wanted to control the Confederation. And finally, number 6. Prussia was a wealthy country controlled by the Junkers, and whose most important focus was the army. That brings us to the end of our first revision lesson on the geography of Germany and what Germany was like in the early 1840s. Make sure you make some notes here, as these are really important facts that we need to remember as we move through this course. Thank you for listening.